It's an absolute end run around the democratic processes in all three countries. And this is what people need to know. The actual name of it is the Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America. You go right onto your government website and just Google in SPP, Security and Partnership, and it's right there. That's the name of it. That's the formal title of the document that they signed. Now, we call it Fortress North America. I mean, there are other ways of describing it. We call it deep integration of the continent. That's a description of it, but the actual treaty they signed is the Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America. It was signed in March 2005 in Waco, Texas, with then Prime Minister Paul Martin, George Bush, and Vicente Fox of Mexico. They met again a year later in March 2006 in Cancun. Then we had a new Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who's a Bush clone, Little Bush we call him, and George Bush and Vicente Fox. And this time they set up a North American Competitiveness Council with 30 major CEOs of big corporations like Walmart, Lockheed Martin. All these big companies are now co-governing this new project for the Americas, for North America. And we call it Fortress North America. We think that it's based entirely, exclusively on a big business model. They have pushed, and they're going to get it, a whole series of cross-border negotiations to harmonize standards in everything from food safety, health, seeds. Every form of environmental regulation is all being harmonized to the lowest common standard, and then set in a excuse me, a trinational framework, so that if you don't agree and you don't like that in your own country, you don't just have to convince Congress, you have to convince the bloc that these standards are too low. They're moving to a race to the bottom, survival of the fittest, pro-big business agenda on this continent that is really awful. And I think if most Americans and Canadians and Mexicans, just ordinary people, knew about what the Security and Prosperity Partnership was, they would be very upset. It's the worst of NAFTA on steroids, but it has not come back to the legislatures of our three countries to be ratified or not ratified. It's been done with no debate. There's only one sector that they're negotiating with and listening to, and that's the big business sector. Nobody else. You're concerned about environment or health or human rights. Nothing. None of those issues matters. This is a model based on what's good for corporate North America. And they have got the governments of the three countries just saying, how far do you want to go? What would you like? How can we serve you? It's quite stunning. And I think if the people of North America had the ability to vote on this, they would vote against it. Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America is 2 3/4 years old. So it's there. It's really established, although it's not established in the minds of people. It just doesn't exist yet. But it's getting, in my country, it's getting well known. Suddenly it's become quite contentious. And they're going to be meeting again in August of 2007, this time in Canada. They'll be able to keep police from letting any of us get anywhere near this big resort area. And I expect there'll be a big protest, and I expect that's when you're going to start hearing about it. Why are Canadians upset about this? I think we're going to have some Americans coming up to join us, and it's going to get put on the radar screen then. But meanwhile, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cross-border working groups working already on every sector of this Fortress North America, from harmonizing our defense and operational capacities, to the security systems and border systems, to harmonizing our food systems, food and trade in food, to harmonizing something they call a tested once policy, so that if one of the countries has given something the okay, like a new chemical, the other countries have to abide by it. And they're shifting from what's called the precautionary principle, where you're not supposed to let something to the market until you're sure it's safe, to something called risk assessment, which is basically, well, you let it out, you want to make sure it's not going to kill a whole bunch of people right away, but you're not waiting till you know it's safe. You're taking a certain risk because there's money to be made and you don't want to hurt the economy. That's all being negotiated. This is part of this whole new process, cross-border. I mean, I can show you the documents. I'm not making this up. It was a result of 9/11. The Canadian big business lobby decided that they got nervous that the border was going to start to get more tough to get across with all the trade, because so much of our trade goes to the United States. And so they basically said to the Bush administration, what can Canada offer up that you'll keep that border open? Because there was, the concerns that maybe all the terrorists came from Canada, which they did not. Please tell I want your listeners to know that this is not true. But that was the subtext there, was that border's not safe and Canada harbors terrorists, so what can we do? And so they convinced our government at the time to basically offer up a whole bunch of areas of harmonization. And they started negotiations to create a common market, in North American common market, to have one security regime. So your war on terror in the United States becomes North American war on terror. And we'd have one security perimeter, one premier in Canada called zip-locking North America into one security perimeter, harmonized immigration, harmonized refugee processes, harmonized entry point standards, so that if somebody's coming to North America and has no intention of traveling to the other countries, they have to convince the bloc they can get in. So it's like the European Union, only without the environmental and human rights safeguards that they built into Europe. And resources is a huge part of it. Basically, they're moving towards a system where the resources of the bloc belong to the bloc. And of course, for Canadians, that means Canadian resources, Canadian water, Canadian energy, and so on. And it also means, and it's not that we don't want to share our energy, it also means that we don't collectively bring in a much more rational, sensible policy around our resource use, because it's just this notion that it's unlimited, which is not true. There's also, I think for Mexicans, the big issue is that they want that access to cheap labor to move it up to the United States and to Canada when needed, but they can't stay as refugees, so they can't claim status. They're basically sent back home. So they're harmonizing every sector of the environment, from chemicals to forestry to mining to automobiles to energy, along a business model, because they're only talking to the big business community on all three sides of the border. That's the only group that's co-negotiating, co-governing this thing. And so based on that model, they're harmonizing all of the standards right across the board. And they're basically following the model that George Bush brought in when he was governor of Texas. And he basically allowed a voluntary code for energy and automobiles. And he basically said, we won't have laws anymore, or we'll exempt you from those laws, and you set up your own regulatory code and report on yourselves, or don't, And as you know, George Bush has gutted something like 400 environmental regulations, either fully or at least partially. So we are moving towards that model of deregulation on a continental basis. And it's going to be much harder to get some of those rules rescinded or get them back if you've lost the democratic right within your own country to do this, no matter which of the three countries you live in, because you now have to convince the bloc. So it's really
how would you convince
well,
them?
you'd have to do it, then you have to move to a North American civil society movement, I guess. I mean, it complicates everything. I don't vote for the United States president. I think the whole world should get to vote for him, or her, by the way, because you guys are so powerful. We should all have a vote here. But the reality is that a lot of the rules are going to be set in Washington. And for those of us living in Canada and Mexico, we're going to feel helpless to make any change. So we're going to have to make deeper alliances with American groups who feel this way, but we don't have the direct vote. So, and for Americans who want a different vision for North America, because this notion that some people have that Americans are like George Bush, I keep saying, no way, you don't know Americans if that's what you think. For Americans who would have a very different vision of what North America could look like, this is a very bad agreement, because it really cuts down the democratic space in which we can create a different vision to really directly deal with the environmental catastrophe of climate change and the water crisis, deforestation that's coming upon us, to deal with the growing inequities between people. I mean, the top 10% in the United States now own 2/3 of the wealth. How do you challenge that? Well, you challenge it with others. But if you've set in place a different model, that makes it far harder to change. So the reality becomes for all of us that it makes it harder to make a better world, to make that difference, to make the difference on our continent. because I don't know any Canadians who are anti-American, who don't, or anti-North American, in the sense that we don't understand that we share a space and that pollution travels across political borders, and water and, air travels back and forth. And if we could have good common standards, and share culture and share our diversity and share our knowledge, that's all good. Nobody's against that. It's an absolute end run around the democratic processes in all three countries. And this is what people need to know. Instead of negotiating something and then coming back to the three legislatures, our parliament and your Congress, to have a debate and to have people pick it apart the way you do with trade agreements. This is like a trade agreement, and say this piece is okay, this piece I can't stand, this piece I go to the wall on, right? There's none of that. It's been a total end run around democracy. And they say, well, it was in the papers. Well, in my country, it was stuck in the business section of one newspaper, and I saw no media in the United States when the original Waco signing happened. None, and we monitored it. Now it's beginning to get a little bit of debate. Unfortunately, in the United States, a little bit of the criticisms coming from the right, the far right, worried about immigration. And they shouldn't, because this is about controlling immigration, bringing in day laborers or weeks or for months or farm laborers, whatever, or up to the oil patch from Mexico, and sending them back when they're finished with them. I mean, it really isn't a pro-people project at all. But unfortunately, that's been the only critique in the United States, and it's really important that we get people concerned with human rights and the environment, social reality, social rights involved in this debate.
And how about the people of Mexico? Have you been working with anybody?
Just beginning. We've got wonderful colleagues in Mexico and the United States. I mean, in all of our different movements. So from free trade and through the NAFTA fight to food issues, to diversity issues, to human rights and so on. This has been really positive. Now we're saying to those groups, hey guys, sorry, but there's a whole new problem, a whole new project that we have to work together on. But because it hasn't had much media in either the United States or Mexico, it's harder to get people's attention. They say, the SPP, what the heck's an SPP? And it's like, well, it's NAFTA on steroids. It's the next step of this project. If you love NAFTA, you're going to love the SPP. If you love George Bush, you're going to love the SPP. If that's not where you are, if you have a different vision for our continent, then we need to work together to defeat this thing.